This is Bonjour Chai, the Challah Back movement edition. I'm Avi Finegold, and I'm here with Phoebe, Maltz, Bovy. We are your Frozen Chosen. On today's show, we talk to Professor Shayna Weiss about her work in gender in Israeli society. We dive into a controversy at Chatelaine magazine and whether that signals a change in gender in politics and how that's reflected in Israeli politics. All this and more coming right up. Lots of things happening this week before we get to our main interview. Just a couple of brief things on our minds. Today, as we're recording on Thursday, Dawson College and I believe other schools have also chosen to close as a result of a proposed strike by a variety of Palestinian solidarity groups and student groups saying that they should boycott school on Thursday. And essentially today, as we're recording, Dawson has chosen to close school for the day instead of having this potential strike on its hands. The Jewish community is up in arms that they said that we should be having school as usual, and the school has decided to say, listen, we care about security and safety of our students and we don't want a debacle on our hands, so we've closed school. Where's your feeling on this, Phoebe?
I know that when I was a student myself, I always found it annoying if professors would say like, oh, it's fine if you go skip class for this protest, because, you know, like they shouldn't be deciding which are okay or not to skip class for, you know what I mean? So what was the percent of the student body likely to not?
I have no idea. I assume it was a significant enough minority that it was going to cause a disruption, and they thought that it would cause enough of a ruckus for the rest of them. I actually don't think that teachers should excuse an absence. They should say, listen, you should take the courage of your convictions and you should take one of your absences if you really believe in this. But if you don't believe in this, school is school. And I'm going to be here teaching.
Like the typical Jewish student at Dawson College, having once been a Jewish student at Dawson College, maybe you can speak to this. What do you think that person's feeling is about all this?
I would believe that the typical student at Dawson College, Jewish student at Dawson College, is probably Zionist and does not support such a protest.
No, but do you think they would object to the school closing for the day? Because you were saying the Jewish community is up in arms.
Look, if I was a rational student, I would be disappointed that I couldn't go to school that day because it meant that a minority of students were shutting down school for safety reasons. But I also, if I was a rational student, would understand that maybe it makes more sense that I should not go to school and worry about my safety than go to school and have to say I'm standing proud and standing strong because of my Judaism.
Is it that the school closing is interpreted by some as a concession to, is it effectively saying we're all going to boycott now? You know what I mean? Like, is that the... No,
I don't think so. In the statements that I've seen, it's like, we don't want you to hijack our education, right? So because of your fear for safety.
The question with all of these protests at this point is what exactly, so like when you said that it's pro-Palestinian and because of the war and stuff, do they have specific demands of Dawson College, or is it like a Remember Gaza thing?
I'm sure they do.
The reason I was thinking just about specific demands is because of another topic that we're going to cover more in a later episode about the Giller Prize and protesters there, where the connection between the thing they're angry at and Israel's actions in a war are not as direct as one might hope. It's not that there's no connection, but sometimes it's a little bit like this is associated with this is associated with this. Let's protest the thing we have access to. It's both unclear by what mechanism this changes anything in the Middle East, and it's also these things kind of take on a life of their own and backfire in certain ways at home and end up basically being life is unpleasant for Jews locally and nothing changes in the Middle East.
I don't know if you remember a few weeks ago we were talking to Will Adler about the vibe election that was happening in America, right? And I think that this movement is a vibes movement in very similar ways, in the sense that you will always try to say that this has some direct action. But as you are pointing out, those things are often tenuous. And at the end of the day, the vibes discourse is about saying, this is what I feel, and I'm not going to let facts get in the way of my feeling that this is actually what's going on.
Well, I think what's missing from the whole conversation is like a bigger picture of what would actually stop the violence that I do not have the answer to. And I think there's this kind of simplistic notion that you could just disarm Israel and then everything's fine, as if this wouldn't just create a whole different set of issues.
Yeah, exactly. And that same thing is happening here. The same thing is happening anywhere there is an anti-Zionist, pro-Palestinian protest, is that we feel that we have to do this, regardless of what we're thinking about is actually going to change whatever it is that we're trying to do.
Avi, I'm going to make a confession. I still don't think I entirely understand what a vibe is. But props to you for being so with it.
Speaking of good vibes, though, you had a nice little profile in Tablet Magazine. What's that like? Being profiled? I've never, I don't know. It's kind of cool.
It is,
especially for a book that's not even out yet.
That's right. So I am writing a book, tentative title, The Last Straight Woman. It's about female heterosexuality today. And yes, Blake Smith, a writer for Tablet, he wrote about my first book, about just writing I've done, and it's neat. I'm flattered and honored, and I was happy with it. It's called The Ethics of Self-Interpretation, and it's in Tablet. It's like a profile of my writing. It's not a profile of me as a person. It's not, here she is at home in her living room, with her IKEA couch, and isn't this glamorous?
Yes, that's why we come to Bonjour Chai for that.
Exactly. That's why that aspect of my life has no media presence.
Well, definitely go check out that article. It's in Tablet. It's Blake Smith, and you'll get to know more about Phoebe's writing, and we cannot wait to read the book and hear more about it when that comes out. Next, our interview with Dr. Shayna Weiss. We got a special guest in town for a few days, and we decided we have to get her on the show because her knowledge, her breadth is like everything. It covers so many different topics. Dr. Shayna Weiss.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome to Bonjour Chai.
Thank you for having me.
First, start by telling us just a little bit. There's so many different areas that you're doing and you studied. What do you tell us about yourself?
So my official title is I am the Senior Associate Director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University, which is a very long title, but I am involved in the day-to-day running of our Israel Studies Center, teaching, programming, research, scholarship. I have a PhD in Hebrew and Judaic Studies from NYU. Before I was at Brandeis, I taught at the United States Naval Academy, which was a fun journey. I've also taught in Israel at various places. My own areas of expertise and interest, I would put in two areas. One is the ultra-Orthodox or the Haredi community, especially in Israel. And the other, I would say, are the politics of popular culture in Israel. Music, television, movies, etc. Just to give you a taste of some of the things that I do, I just finished an academic article about the 20 or so television shows about Haredi Jews that have aired in Israel over the past 20 years or so. I watched every single one of them and tried to ask the question of, why are there so many? What do I think is going on here? And what can it tell us about Israeli society? So that's
the title of the paper of Shtisel?
It's not just about Shtisel. Did we end on it's the new black or something? Which is, but yeah, the puns were there. There were a lot of puns.
Black is the new black.
Black is the new black.
So I'm so excited to be meeting you. And I also have a great interest in television shows. And I am in absolute envy/awe that you have managed to turn this into academic research. How does one do this? I ask for our audience and for my own personal curiosity. How do you get to study popular culture in academia? How did this come to be?
I learned Hebrew sort of beyond the Aleph Bet as an undergraduate at Brandeis, where I did my undergraduate degree. And I spent my junior year at Hebrew U, where I also did Ulpan. And I remember thinking oh, this is how you learn a language. You watch TV, you listen to music. Even if you don't understand every word, you get a lot out of it. So that's what I started doing. And I was in Israel at that point. So it was easy to watch television, listen to music as much as possible. And I noticed that some of the conversations that were happening in America about race and representation and who's on and who's not were happening in Israel also in really interesting ways. Especially things that I was interested in, religion, gender, were coming up on Israeli television. Shortly thereafter, the show Srugim aired, which is a show that some of you may know about religious Zionists in their late 20s and early 30s and dating in Jerusalem. It's sort of like a modern Orthodox version of Friends.
Where the world first got to find out about tefillin dates.
Exactly. That was one of the first. And it was I actually got a decent amount of resistance from my advisors. They were like, this isn't a traditional thing to study. Like, we don't know how to study this. You won't get a job, et cetera, et cetera. But I sort of kept at it. And I will say over the past, let's say like 10 years or so, there's been a huge depth of appreciation for studying culture, studying pop culture, bringing in different sort of techniques. Sometimes people still look askew at it, but it's a lot more accepted now than when I started. But I think it's a great way to learn about society and people and industry and culture and change.
If I can ask a question as an example, and I don't know if you've written about this, but I'm sure you've thought about this. How has popular culture changed since October 7th in Israel, either in music or on TV, things along those lines?
First of all, like the industry shut down, like with everything else. People stopped recording records, stopped filming TV shows, concerts were canceled, etc. A lot of artists did things, for relief, singing for soldiers, singing for wounded, singing for evacuees. And of course, the themes changed, for, I would say, almost 6 months. All of the things that came out of Israel were directly related to the events of the day or shortly thereafter. Songs about loss, songs about war. There's some that are really, really interesting. A personal favorite of mine is Odaya and I think Shrek DMC have a song called The Winter of 23, where it's this really interesting, almost like theological take on what happens. It was interesting also when the first sort of regular pop songs started coming out, right? And the regular TV shows started resuming. I think it will take a long time for us, of course, to see the sort of ripple effect of all of this and how it changes. But one other thing I would say as well is that in terms of reception of Israeli artists abroad, right? We already hear reports of people being boycotted or soft boycotted or that sort of thing. And it's a big question for artists if they want to have an international audience or if they want to be accepted to film festival. I think it's a lot harder for them. At the same time, I've seen more Israeli artists tour in America, specifically for Jewish and Israeli audiences. So like Aviv Geffen was in Boston last week. That's interesting.
So this is something that I did want to ask about, this kind of siloing that seems to be happening in the culture where there's like the pro-Israel literary magazine and the anti-Israel literary magazine, and things that didn't used to be split along those lines getting split along those lines. And yeah, I was wondering if you could just expand a bit on which audiences specifically have been lost and which have been gained.
So first, I think it's important to separate between, let's say, the non-Israeli conversations happening.
Yeah.
So I would say, I'm actually less familiar with what's been happening outside. Within Israel, I would say the challenge is often the opposite, is that there's a hugely intensely right-wing push. And there's a lot of criticism of anyone who deviates from that.
So I was going to ask that. There was a song that was really viral in the early days. I don't want to get into that. Was pretty violent. It was really anti-Arab.
Harbu Darbu, yes.
You can say it.
Yeah.
Omar Adams' recent single was like had the image of him in his army uniform going out to serve. Is there not like lefty leaning artists that are putting out things that are able to like get their voice cut through, or is that really stifled by this pro-right push towards what's going on?
So I think there's a couple of things. I think that even if political support, let's say, for the leadership is mixed, there's still pretty high support for the war among Jewish Israelis. I wouldn't call it actual censoring, but I think that people know that if they say something that they feel sort of out of step, that they will be criticized, canceled. They may feel it's not the right time. I mean, as the war goes on, I think that may start to shift. I also think Israeli society is just a lot more right-wing than it was. For Israeli Palestinians, right? So, or Arab Israelis, 28% of Israel's population, we know of cases where people have put up Facebook posts. There was just a very long article in the New York Times about this, where their speech, whether they were prominent people or not, people have been arrested, people have put into jail. There's been other forms of social pressure. I would say if a community is feeling in a very complicated place or they can't speak freely, that's where it's happening. And I hear that daily from friends in that world.
So something, this is maybe a bit out there, but something that's come up just in conversations we've been having at the Canadian Jewish News is restaurant listings evading mentioning that a restaurant is Israeli, although I have also seen this evading mentioning that a restaurant is Palestinian and saying Mediterranean. So my question for you, though, is, are Israelis aware of how taboo Israeliness often is perceived, in other...
They're very aware.
Okay.
I would also say, if I'll be political for a second, it is the interest of the current government in Israel is very interested in making sure that Israelis are aware of that also. First of all, I'll say we know that like Jewish restaurants, kosher or not, are an interesting place where Jewish identity works itself out, right? Mm-hmm. All cuisine changes when it's in a different place, right? Michael Solomonov, who is a brilliant Israeli-American chef, talks about how he created an Israeli restaurant that doesn't exist in Israel. Zahav. He takes a little bit of like the place where you get meat skewers, a little bit of the hummus place, and he puts them all together, right? Because he wants you to have this full experience. But it's not a restaurant that actually exists in Israel. And so all cuisine is going to change. Also, a lot of this is just like awareness and what people know. Like in Jacksonville, Florida, where I grew up, there's a big Lebanese/Syrian/Palestinian population. They immigrated a while ago, like over 100 years ago. So there are restaurants that if I were to think of their menus today, I would call them Palestinian restaurants, but they were often called Lebanese restaurants. It reminds me of sometimes people who would say they're Persian instead of they're Iranian. So I think these things are always sort of in flux. And I'm sure there are examples, right, of wanting to be Mediterranean and not Israeli, and how do you signify certain things to people who they know. But also, of course, the boundaries of what's Israeli food and what's not, just like with any other cuisine, Israel's indifferentness is really complicated and fluid. They're not clear-cut definitions.
Sure. But like you don't get an Italian restaurant. Well, let's leave it at yes, it is complicated. It's definitely complicated.
Right. Like I remember I was in a Arab restaurant in Israel, like in the north, like in an Arab town with a group. And I remember the owner telling me that he had to start serving schnitzel, even though he thinks schnitzel is Jewish, because everyone comes in. It's like a classic Arab restaurant. Everyone comes in and, they order grilled chicken or grilled meat or whatever. And the kids are like, I want schnitzel and French fries. And he's like, this is annoying. I don't want to serve this in my restaurant. But also like people complain. So I was like, fine, we'll put it on for a kid's meal.
So speaking of food and signifiers, Phoebe, you wrote a column that we want to discuss. Let's hear about that right after the break.
This is an audition to be a cantor.
But I don't want to be a cantor.
I wasn't raised with any religion. You're Jewish, though.
The heartbeat of community.
I welcomed Sam into my community by first taking his foreskin and next showing him the beautiful Twister bagel.
Culturally Jewish is the only podcast covering the weird, wide world of independent Canadian Jewish art.
Listen to Culturally Jewish at the cjn.ca/culture or wherever you get your podcasts.
Phoebe, can you tell us what happened with Chatelaine and why it's important or not?
I will do my best. I did not grow up with Canadian women's magazines lying around the house, but I have since learned that Chatelaine is like the major kind of women's magazine. That doesn't mean that it's a women's magazine from the 1950s. It's something that has, kept up with the culture and, sort of...
It's like a cross between Vogue and Better Homes and Gardens.
The thing that's at the supermarket where it's like got the casseroles, but also a little bit higher end. I don't know. But this is all necessary background for what I'm going to say is that Chatelaine ran an article that went up and down again and is, according to its editor-in-chief, who I reached out to about this, going to go back up again, by MasterChef Canada 2019 winner named Jennifer Crawford. Crawford wrote a personal essay about how they bake challah in a kind of self-care tikkun olam practice with the aim of, in this context, freeing Palestine. And there's a picture accompanying the article of Crawford with a denim shirt that has what looks like a pocket square kind of, but it is in fact an upside down red triangle. And somebody complained. Wasn't me.
I mean, I can totally see you complaining so that you can write a column about the ensuing chaos.
I was not reading Chatelaine. Somebody didn't like the red triangle pointed out to an apparently flummoxed Chatelaine that this could be associated with Hamas and support for Hamas. And they responded by taking down the article from the press reader version, like the online kind of pseudo print version. And they're going to put up another one, they say. This has yet to happen. It's interesting because the article itself, it's not different. This is an article that talks a lot about Palestinian suffering and the war with no mention at all of October 7th. You would think that Israel just was this bloodthirsty nation that just decided for absolutely no reason, whatever you think of Israel's response, even if you think it was the worst possible response, and I don't think it was the best possible response personally, but you wouldn't know that something like that had happened. So a few things here are interesting. One is that this was not the first instance of something being sort of unpublished from a women's magazine in Canada this fall on this issue, Elle Canada, where a pro-Palestinian Canadian politician was sort of featured as one of their impressive women, whatever, and then they took this down because people complained again. But I should say, I don't think that people should be unpublishing articles. That's not my jam. I don't like that. Even if I don't like the article, here is a case where I didn't like the article, and I also don't think it should have been unpublished. But the other aspect, and this is what I was trying to write about, is just women's magazines and what they've been, not since the dawn of time history of women's magazines, like the kind of 2020 to 2021 social justice awakening of the types of publications that used to be here's how to look pretty for a man, are now more social justice oriented, a very different thing. And what has happened now, where there's this new wave of social justice interest that is more divisive. I have found this all very interesting. I don't really have a polemic about it. But yeah, I wanted to talk about it.
Well, can I start with a polemic about the challah itself first, before we get to the politics part? But the challah as a cultural signifier, and the challah bakes and the baking challah.
Oh, I have so much to say about this.
I have nothing to say about this, so please, Cook, the two of you could.
Soapbox, please, and just I cannot stand that both within the liberal non-Haredi communities, but also within the Haredi communities, the challah bakes have become this coded female way of praying, of being holy, or of doing something traditional.
Is this sourdough during the pandemic?
Look, I started baking challah recently, but it's just, to me, another thing that I do for cooking for Shabbat. I don't have any deep spiritual significance to it. And I just can't deal with the fact that it's there and it's become this sacred woman's thing. So please start with that. And then
you have come to the right person. My first thought reading it was actually that this idea of a challah bake as a spiritual task, that which came really from, I would say, the Haredi community, has traveled all the way to the most liberal parts of the Jewish community. That is really interesting to me. So there is a whole world of religious spiritual innovation in the ultra-Orthodox and the Haredi community that is really, really interesting. You may have heard, I don't know, Avi, you may have heard of amen parties or bracha parties.
Yeah.
So it's all these really interesting things because these women don't have the sort of classic spiritual outlets of leading prayers or learning Torah, and there's a need for ritual and things like that. These things have developed. Challah baking is one of them, and perhaps has become the most popular, where you, it's a whole thing of baking the challah, separating the challah. There are professional challah Instagram influencers that you can hire to do challah baking for bachelorette parties or marriage parties.
My niece's bat mitzvah.
Right.
And am I allowed to ask whether inside of this challah there is a scantily clad man?
Yeah, pops out. There's often a huge ceremony. I'm happy also, of course, to send you some accounts either for you to look at or whatever. Mm-hmm. This is a huge thing for not just religious women in Israel and secular women as well. There are people who blow shofars. It's wild and really, really interesting. And it's spread to the rest of the Jewish world as well. It is not my thing per se. I have nothing against it. Also, I would say as an academic, I'm less interested in judging it and just more interested in observing and understanding.
That's why I left academia, because I like judging things.
Oh, I will. Very, very fair. We judge it too. But what I would say in the sort of, let's say, non-Haredi world, which I live, I am not Haredi, is that I think anyone could benefit from a challah bake or separating challah. I happen to find it personally a really beautiful ritual, and I like baking challah. I don't love the sort of how gendered it's become, but I see how that happened.
I like to point out to people that on any given day in the world, there are more men separating challah than there are women, because they're the ones doing all the commercial bakery.
All the commercial baking, right. So that is fascinating to me, because it's actually a relative, I mean, yes, taking challah has obviously existed for a long time. The Mishnah talks about it, but as a spiritual practice, something you do, that is relatively new. So that's one thing that, that stuck out to me. The other thing was, you're talking about women's magazines, and I actually think women's magazines has always been political in interesting sort of ways. Maybe not progressive, right? But in America, right, there's Cosmopolitan is probably the most famous one. And a lot of these magazines had these complicated social agendas, right? Where, yes, there were tips on like how to look good for your husband, but there are also tips on like how to, I would say like how to wear pants at work.
Right. I mean, the magazines have always been a mix. And this is something I get up to a bit in the column about, like, this was a place where if you couldn't get published elsewhere because you were a woman,
right, often
this is where you would publish. So like Sylvia Plath getting her start, it wasn't Mademoiselle, is winning some contest, I think, famously. These have always been serious places. They've always been places where serious writing has appeared. And they've always been places where different types of empowerment, as Chatelaine puts it in its About page now, has occurred for women. It's not new. So I was looking at what is new, because something is new. One of the things is indeed this sort of the way the lifestyle sphere has shifted from being for women specifically to being a kind of everybody but cisgender men space. And also more broadly towards standing up for the underdog more broadly. And here I'm thinking especially of like Teen Vogue and the trajectory that it has gone on. So while, yes, these magazines have always been political, and no, they have not always limited themselves to here's a nice outfit, here's how to not eat carbs or whatever it used to be. I mean, I grew up in the 90s. That's what I remember in a women's magazine, And here's where I have to always cite my other podcast co-host, Kat Rosenfield, who, when we talked about the trajectory of women's magazines several years ago, referred to women's magazines as having switched their focus from problem areas to problematic areas. And that's
a good line.
It's not that they went from frivolous to serious, it's that something has changed. And then something, I guess what I'm interested in here is the sort of 2020, 2021 shift, and then the 2023, 2024 shift as kind of two different shifts. Yeah.
I think about magazines. I don't read women's magazines. I do read a lot of magazines, including what would be coded as men's magazines. I think that historically men's magazines were not political, simply because except with the exception, I think, of Playboy. Playboy always had a strong political bent.
Right.
It's not that I read it for the articles, not that I ever.
You had to say it, didn't you?
But that if you were male and you were interested in politics, you picked up Commentary or Jacobin or whatever. You didn't pick up GQ. You picked up GQ because you were a man and you were interested in fashion.
Right.
And that doesn't necessarily happen on the women's side. And so what we're seeing is, in my mind at least, it's not so much the politicization of women's magazines, it's the politicization of women, period.
I think it has a lot to do with consumption, and that consumption has become increasingly politicized. And again, not that it wasn't before, but the sort of optics of it. And I think actually a lot of this has to do with social media, right? That you're like, I am buying X because I support Y value, right? And it's coming from multiple different directions. This is not a right-left thing, right? Because you can broadcast that act. You're like, this is how I'm part of it. This is what I can do, right? I can fight the fight by boycotting XYZ, right? And so it becomes important that all your consumption is sort of in line with your values. And that's also become something that you can broadcast. So I think that's a big part of it. And I also think that, there's a real focus on changing who are the sort of dominant voices, right? And a movement away from sort of, as you said, like white cisgender women, and bringing in different voices. And it's a different discourse, and it's there, and it's interesting. But in some ways, I feel like it's also a sort of visioning of classic conscious raising.
That's a Freudian slip.
It was quite the Freudian slip, I should say. And
I was waiting for Avi's reaction.
Yeah. It was like,
I'll stand by it. It works.
I think it's good.
A re-envisioning of classic feminist conscious raising, right? We're going to get in our circles. We're going to sit around. We're going to talk about this so that we're aware and we can do something.
Yes, yes.
The question that I have, this is happening at the same time as the reckoning that we're seeing over the past few weeks that women don't vote as one block anymore. There's no such thing as the woman voter. And that
was there a time in which women
did vote?
Was there
ever really, but there was always this perception, right? Black voters vote like this, Latino voters vote like this. And then on top of that is the idea that the recognition, and there was a great piece in The Atlantic about this, that America is still deeply misogynistic and isn't ready to elect any woman, not necessarily this specific woman or that specific woman.
I also think it's important to point out that there are plenty of women who are conservatives who carry this agenda and are part of this agenda. You know, if we're thinking about any right-wing movement in America is no different, is that there are plenty of women who believe this very strongly, and it's part of their identities and it's part of what they do. And of course, there are women on different sides as well. There also does seem to be, and you mentioned this in the column, gender differences coming out in politics, right? We know, even though there are plenty of conservative women, on the whole, on the sort of under 30, whatever, at least in America, that women tend to be more liberal and men tend to be more conservative, right?
And that's global. And what's interesting is the global pattern there.
Right.
Yeah, so exactly. How is that? So we wanted to ask you, Israel, how does this happen in Israel? Is there a left-right divide by gender in Israel?
No. I don't think so.
Okay, so then Israel would be the exception, because there was something,
Israel
think in the
in
Financial
general is an
Times
exception in that the population has shifted significantly to the right as opposed to the left. The younger you are in Israel, the more right-wing you tend to be. That has been true since basically after the Second Intifada, and I don't expect that to shift anytime soon. I would say it's both a political shift, but also a demographic shift as well.
I was actually thinking about it in terms of the other thing that I brought up, the misogyny, that even though Israel has elected in the past a female leader, I don't think that Israel would elect a female leader in the foreseeable future either.
No.
What about a different leader in general?
Well, first of all, I would say the current government in the current coalition has some of the lowest female participation of almost any Israeli government. If you look at pictures, I mean, this is something that's discussed constantly of like cabinet meetings and things like that. There literally are not women at the table. In Israel, there's a bunch of different factors. One, of course, is that the army service gives legitimacy, right, in the political sphere, and obviously women have that less.
But most women will have served in the military, just not as much.
Yes, but they are not serving in high-ranking combat positions that are going to grant them this kind of legitimacy. There is also a feminist argument that I am sympathetic to, that in some ways, for those Israeli women who do serve in the military, that it actually reinforces inequality. There's a great movie called Zero Motivation. I highly recommend it. It's from 2014. That is basically the living version of this article about two very bored female soldiers on a base. I will also say that there are parties, religious parties, that do not allow women representation.
I am shocked by that.
Well, no, to be fair, for example, and we spoke about her on the podcast. I mean, there are very few and far between, but there's a Haredi woman that was an elected official in Montreal. She still is. There's a Haredi woman that was elected as a judge in New York. So there is more freedom there to have a voice.
There is also a movement within Israel, nivcharot v'lo bocharot, basically that they are arguing like, if you won't elect us, we won't vote for you, I would say is a loose translation from the Haredi community that says, we will not vote for Haredi parties until there are women on the list, right? The way that these things work is there's often you don't usually vote for a candidate. Basically, there's a list of people 1 to 20 or 1 to 120. And let's say they get 10 mandates, right? 10 seats, they get the first 10 people on the list. Mm-hmm. So there is discussion around that. I would not say it's mainstream, but they get a lot of news attention. I would also say Israeli culture is really masculine heavy, very aggressive, and
you think?
Yeah. And the events of the past year have obviously made that more so. Israel's not the only place, obviously, like that, that has a sort of aggressive political culture.
Is there a difference in how they would vote? Is there like a split right-left? Do you think that the wives of Haredi men or the single Haredi women are more left, or because they have a different idea of what needs to be or should be or could be?
So I will say this, in that I have friendly with the people in Israel who are have organized what's called the Smol Emuni, or the faithful left. And one of my friends who grew up in the religious Zionist community, he was shocked by how many Haredi women showed up to his events, to his organizers, and that sort of thing. And he even said one of the reasons, and this is getting into like labels in Israel, that it's the faithful left, the Emuni, and not Dati, is because these Haredi women are like, we're not Dati, because that signifies like religious Zionist, modern Orthodox. So don't call us Dati, because that's not us. So I think for those women who are already somewhat interested in being political, they are, but I'm not convinced, right? And I'll just give an example from a different area, is that when we think about participation in the workforce in the Haredi community, there is no difference between Haredi women who work, no statistical difference in terms of percentages, and Jewish women. It's about 80% for both. And that has risen over the past 10 or 15 years due to a lot of things we can talk about. The men's participation in the workforce has actually plateaued in the last 5 to 10 years. It's still around 55 or so percent. One of the theories of why it's plateaued for men is that Haredi women now can work decently enough and get paid decently enough so the men don't have to work. They're like, oh, I'm finally making enough money in my office job or my lawyer job, so you can go sit and learn.
Yeah, the classic joke around this was that the Haredi community is now getting rid of the ban on bigamy because they heard that there's such a thing as two-income households.
Right. Right. There's a lot of jokes and things like that. But I'm not convinced, but it's an interesting thing to think about.
So there are a few threads that go to things we've talked about before on Bonjour Kai that we could talk about here. I mean, one is I'm thinking about just like the pro-Palestine protest movement in the States has been noted for being heavily female, like the campus protests. This has been written about a little bit, and that it's just sort of interesting how things are shaking out left versus right, with like being pro-Israel as being kind of like this masculine coded thing, like the frat boys who were defending the US flag at some college or whatever, things like that. So that's one thread. But then but now I'm thinking about another thing, because you were talking about the we won't vote for you if you don't run women candidates sort of boycott type thing. There was something in the lead up to the US election where there was this Julia Roberts ad that showed a woman sort of secretly voting for Harris despite her Trump voting husband. Okay. And this was very much this kind of meme, rumor, something prior to the election, that Trump voters were these women whose Trump voting husbands filled in the ballot for them, were abusive or something like this. And I think I don't want to, discount the existence of coercive men, but like, there are just conservative women, right? Like, I mean, I feel like this just does get kind of, I
have to do like the podcast thing where I'd be like, you can't see me rolling my eyes. Is that like, So first of all, like, obviously domestic violence exists in all sorts of spheres, but also like, why don't we just take seriously and believe that like these women are actually just conservative voters?
I think that would be helpful.
Right?
I mean, Trump is loading up his cabinet with people like Kristi Noem and Elise Stefanik. And
there's a lot of men voted for Harris and a lot of women voted for Trump. And the split is not actually all that stark.
This has been great. Dr. Shayna Weiss.
Thank you.
Go check her out. You have like multiple places where you can find you online. You're writing a book on Haredi women, I believe, or Haredi men.
I'm writing a book on gender segregation in Israel, and not the question of is it legal or not. I'll leave that to the lawyers. But what does it say about how Haredim relate to the state when they ask the state to sort of enact religious dictates for them? And the core example of the book is the gender segregated beach.
I can't wait to read this.
We just watched the movie this week.
Oh, the documentary?
The documentary, Kosher Beef. We literally just watched that this week.
Okay. Yeah, it's a fun movie. Yeah. It doesn't go into like the history so much, but I love that it interviews the characters who hang out there.
That sounds really, really,
check it out.
Really fantastic.
Yeah,
it's a great documentary.
Okay, well, I cannot wait to read that book.
Thank you.
Coming up right after this, our Nachas. Shayna, do you have a Nachas for us?
I'll start out with my dear friend and actually Canadian-Israeli writer, Ayelet Sabari. Her first novel. She's written memoirs and short stories before, Songs for the Brokenhearted. It's a beautiful story about a Yemenite family and loss. There's a mystery. If you're interested in the Mizrahi experience in Israel and just a beautiful book in general, I recommend it.
Phoebe, do you have a Nachas for us?
I do, and it's going to be a sort of change of pace nachas because it's more like a homework assignment, but don't worry, nobody's checking if you've done it or not. We have alluded to that we are going to talk about the Gillers and the significance of that drama in a future episode, and so a few pieces to read. I'm going to give you 3. I'm going to just overload everybody, okay? Ready to be overloaded?
Here's my homework.
So there is a newsletter by Lydia Perovic, The Giller Prize of the Future on Substack. The next is by my other podcast co-host, Kat Rosenfield, in the Boston Globe. Her article, Can We Please Have Less Political Art Now? Okay, so this is about like the impact of the election in the US on art and what that may be. And another is Dean Kissick's Harper's Magazine cover story, The Painted Protest, How Politics Destroyed Contemporary Art. Yeah, these are, I think, all different pieces of a puzzle that I'm trying to make sense of the connection between politics and art, what it is, what it ought to be. You know, I'm sure nobody has anything else to do. So just read these reams of text we've sent your way. But you know what? Maybe you are looking for stuff to read, in which case, enjoy. What have you got, Avi?
I am going to point us to a Substack.
Oh.
And you're going to be confused for a second. But the Substack is called Chinese Cooking Demystified.
Okay.
And there is a post up there that came out this week called 63 Chinese Cuisines, Our Best Shot at a Comprehensive-ish Guide. They make these like points of how to define the boundaries of a cuisine. And this was the piece that really blew my mind. And I'm going to read them out to you really briefly. They have 4 principles for discussing how to differentiate one cuisine from the other. One is passing the 50% rule. If you'd estimate that more than 50% of the dishes are unique and the dishes that remain often have different versions, it's a separate cuisine. Culinary self-determination. Do the people themselves make a distinction between cuisine? Do people in Louisiana quickly make a distinction between Cajun food and Creole food? And culinary continuums must be broken up somewhere, a little like dialect continuums in linguistics. Now, all that got me thinking about all of the discussions that we've had both on the show and off about Israeli and Palestinian and Mediterranean and Middle Eastern food. And so learning about the cuisine of a world which I'm rarely ever getting into really wrapped my head around the fact that like we can't really talk about hummus or falafel or pitas in the same way that we talk about like, well, they're so different and I want to own this and you don't get to own this. And so I highly recommend it. I mean, it was an interesting, rollicking read in and of itself, but I learned about Middle Eastern food from Chinese food. Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for the week ending November 23rd, Shabbat Parashat Chaye Sarah. The show is produced by Michael Fraiman and edited by Zach Kauffman. The executive producer for CJN Podcast is Michael Fraiman. Our music is by So-Called. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. You can listen to all our past episodes on our page at thecjn.ca/bonjour, and you can subscribe to the podcast and automatically receive all episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love it if you told a friend about Bonjour Chai. It's always one of the best ways we get new listeners. And as always, you can email us with comments at bonjour@thecjn.ca.